the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, November hardcovers and trade paperbacks, DJ Butler sits down with Charles E. Gannon, and we continue our ongoing audiobook serialization of John Ringo's Live Free or Die, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I'm Baen Associate Editor and your podcast host, David F. Sharirad. Today we bring you part one of a two-part interview that DJ Butler conducted with Charles E. Gannon about Gannon's new novel, This Broken World, which is an epic fantasy unlike any other. It is out now in hardcover and all your favorite ebook formats, DRM free at Baen eBooks, of course. But first, the news. The November hardcovers and trade paperbacks are on bookstore shelves everywhere. First up, The Romanoff Rescue by Tom Kratman, Justin Watson, and Casey Azell, which we discussed last week on the podcast. So if you haven't given that episode a listen, I'd recommend it. Can there be a world without communism? Mankind's history is bound up in the fabric of fate, a strong cloth, tough and closely woven. Consider 1918, the last year of the greatest war in human history to date. As the belligerents stagger, Russia descends into civil war and chaos. It is there that a once mighty family awaits its fate. But even the strongest fabric has flaws. An escaped prisoner of war, injured but still highly capable, may be one. An airship at loose ends after a failed mission might be another. A German general suddenly coming face to face with the reality of the monster rising in the east could be a third. And if all these loose threads are somehow yanked out together, the effect just might be enough to tear the fabric of time and to rescue a desperate family, a family that happens to contain the last heirs of Tsars of Russia, and perhaps the Russia that is to come. Next up is This Broken World by Charles E. Gannon. Fate and Revelation. Since boyhood, Druadaen expected he'd command an elite legion and become the leader his father predicted he would be. Fate had other plans. Assigned to a small group of outriders tasked with watching nearby kingdoms, Druadaen discovers that the larger world is riddled with impossibilities. How do humanoid raiders, known as the Bent, suffer staggering losses and yet return as a vast horde every decade? How do multi-ton dragons fly? How have fossils formed in a world which sacrists insist has existed for only 10 millennia? To solve these mysteries, Druadaen journeys into the dank warrens of the Bent, seeks out a dragon's lair, and ventures into long-buried ruins in search of ancient scrolls. But Druadaen's most lethal enemy might lurk in even more unusual places, the temples and council chambers of his own homeland. And of course, we'll have more on that novel from Gannon himself here in just a moment. If short stories are more your speed, well, saddle up, partner. Gunfight on Europa Station is out this month, too. Take the wagon train to space. The final frontier ain't so final in these 12 tales of space exploration and adventure. There's a story for everyone who's ever dreamed of taking that star-dusty trail to the farthest stars, or of facing down a belligerent alien at high noon in a frontier settlement under the light of a strange sun. Get ready to hit the hyper thrusters as you set course for adventure, mystery, romance, and two laser gun slinging action. Yarns by Elizabeth Moon, Alan Dean Foster, Jane Linskold, Will McCarthy, Martin Shoemaker, Alex Schwartzman, and more. And finally, In Fury Born by David Weber. Unleash the Fury. Zikotsky, Shallingsport, Louvain, sacred fields of battle on far-flung worlds where warriors of the imperial cadre spent blood and lives defending human civilization. Alicia DeVries was there. She led the charge. Her reward? Betrayal by a deceitful empire. Retirement to obscurity. Now, Alicia is the only survivor of a brutal attack on her frontier world family. Not since the mighty Achilles has the ancient spirit of the Fury taken up residence inside a human being, but not since Achilles has a warrior so skilled, so implacable, and possessing so much battle sense sprung up among the mass of humankind. Hero of the empire, holder of the banner of Terra. This is a blood price to be paid. The Fury has awakened. Head on over to Baen.com and check out this month's Charles E. Gannon November ebook sale. To celebrate the release of his new novel, This Broken World, we're offering up a cornucopia of savings on Gannon's backlist. Save $2 per book on the award-winning Cain Riordan series and $1 per book on other Gannon backlist titles. The sale ends November 30th, 2021, and these prices are available wherever Baen ebooks are sold. And that's it for the news. And now part one of DJ Butler's discussion with Charles E. Gannon.
All right, welcome. Hi, this is DJ Butler. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. I'm here with Dr. Charles E. Gannon to talk about his new novel, This Broken World. It's out now in it is hardcover, right?
Yes,
it is hardcover. That's very exciting. I didn't even have a question about that. I'm going to add another question to our interview. As well as your favorite ebook formats, DRM free when you purchase them at Baen.com. Of course, Dr. Charles E. Gannon's series include Hard SF Interstellar Epic, the Cain Riordan series set in his Terran Republic universe, along with the braided companion series Murphy's Lawless, and epic slipstream fantasy, This Broken World being book one of the Broken World series we're going to discuss today. His books have been nominated for 4 Nebulas and 3 Dragon Awards. He has won both the Compton Crook Award and the Dragon Award, and his books are consistent national bestsellers. He also collaborates with Eric Flint in that author's New York Times bestselling series, The Ring of Fire, and has published 2 novels in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising series. He's also worked in universes and shared worlds such as War World, The Man-Xin Wars, The Honorverse, etc., and has been published in various anthologies and Analog SF magazine. You can visit and learn more about his various SF universes and projects, past, present, and future at www.charlesegannon.com. Chuck, welcome.
And it's great to be here, Dave.
I'm very excited about this book. I should say I am very fortunate that I've actually read it already, and want to ask you some questions about it. And I'm actually going to start with, I think, sort of a few quotes that I want to talk about. Maybe touch on some bigger ideas, and then get back into the plot and characters a bit. One that really that drew a smile from me was an observation. Now, your protagonist is his name pronounced Druadaen?
Druadaen.
Okay. And that's what people call it. So Daen is the shortened version.
It can be Dane. That's what his parents called him.
Okay. Druadaen, fantastic. So there's this great comment from him at one point. I mean, it's part of his inner monologue, but he says all of the scholars that he's known demonstrated one constant despite personal or cultural differences, a stultifying obsession with their subjective expertise. I thought it's really interesting. And I think, so here's my first question, I guess. Do you see this as an issue generally with the Academy today?
We're going there. Okay.
I just thought this was, well, I think this ties into the kind of protagonist you like to write. This to me is very thematically Charles E. Gannon. So it struck me.
No, and it's funny because I suppose, to give context to viewers, and thank God, because it's an overly long bio as it is. But my background is as a professor. It was not my first choice of a career. It was Plan B. The good news for Plan B was that I was good at it. The bad news for Plan B was that I was good at it, meaning that when you're good at that sort of thing, you suddenly your summers get eaten up. Now you're doing a lot of conferences, and it's hard to write fiction in that sort of situation. Also, when you're a new dad, and that all sort of happened at the same time. One of the reasons why Plan B was really essential. In the course of that, I was very fortunate, and it informs a lot of these books. The Kane Riordan series, probably more than this one. Over the course of that time, I did 5 Fulbrights. 2 were travel. 1 was a doctoral. 2 were they're called senior specialist Fulbright things. There's stuff you do when you can't go for a whole semester or something like that. And in the course of that, I was in a lot of embassy parties. And in the course of that, a lot of the sort of oblique, the obliquity of official discourse in those sort of settings got sort of drummed in my ear. And that shows up, I think, in some of what goes on in this, just because Druadaen, that protagonist, does run into high power people, and high power people for a variety of reasons, not because they're slimy, sometimes they are, but because of their position, frequently are not at liberty to speak as directly as you and I might. And so all of that informed this. But what the real point is that I write that line about stultifying obsession with their area of interest. I think that's what it was. Is definitely something that comes from my time as a professor, which was I spent about 10 years in that profession, and I think that aspect has been a challenge with the Academy from day one.
Yeah.
I think that the higher you get in what you do, the less time you have to do other things. Being a writer, particularly a science fiction or fantasy writer, and for people who are not aware, my interviewer is an extraordinarily accomplished author in those same fields. So he'll smile knowingly, probably, when I say the more you write, the less time you have to read. And I think in general, what happens is when you're a writer is any profession where you're operating at let's say a kind of dedicated level, is your scope begins to narrow. You don't have the time or freedom to really sort of rove. I actually think that being a science fiction or fantasy writer is probably one of the least narrowing, because by definition, you're talking about everything, and you're talking about what might be as well as what is. And it allows us, I think, if we want, to sort of keep our hand in the game. As far as that stultifying effect, yeah, and I would say it's only gotten more intense in the same way that, look at doctors, for instance, and I don't mean doctorates, I mean physical doctors. The number of people who specialized in any area of medicine, let's say 1950, particularly 1930 and before, was very small. You generally, the demand for medical practice was essentially for what we would now call general practitioners. Man, has that flip-flopped. I mean, you can't swing a cat without hitting 10 specialists. I think the same thing has happened in the Academy. I think that the fields of knowledge have grown. And I think that as they have, what's happened is that the silos tighten up and they actually grow narrower, so that you're looking at fields that are now separate, that used to be sort of lumped under one thing. I mean, there was no such thing called cultural studies in 1950. It was a sort of novelty in 1980. Now, if you don't have one, you've got a problem with your program. So yeah, and I think that, unfortunately, my last comment on this is that the politicization of the Academy, to whichever end it goes, is only intensifies that.
Yeah.
And I think what it does is if you're carrying somebody else's ideological water, whose ever that may be,
sure,
at any kind of institution, because there are institutions on far to the right as well as far to the left, you're not doing service to your students. And I think that monomania of a chosen field can really add to that failing to do service to your students. So yeah. And by the way, that the thing you quote, I think, comes from one of his journals, doesn't it?
Oh, it might have been a journal, yeah, but it's definitely it's we're in his head at that point. He doesn't say that to anybody. It's his observation.
Right. Yeah. It's one of the things. This was kind of an interesting thing that I worked out with Tony. Actually, it was new to this book, which was the idea of, we see his progression through his journals, because there was so much in this that I felt wanted first person. There were some comic jabs that I felt could only be done in first person, but it gives a look into his head. But the majority of the novel is a third person limited perspective.
So that's interesting. That sort of gets into the question maybe of like, what is the genre of the novel? Because in we talk about in your biography, which I think maybe must have come from you at one point, that we refer to it as an epic slipstream fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
As I was reading it, one of the things that struck me is in some ways it's sort of a Bildungsroman. It's a novel about a character developing. In fantasy, usually we see that about wizards, right? We see Harry Potter or Ray Feist's Magician series or whatever, right? And so I kept expecting to turn a corner and have Druadaen be a wizard, which at least as of the end of book 1, there's some interesting stuff, but that has not happened yet. Tell me about the genre of the novel.
Best way I can tell you about the genre of the novel is stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Okay.
It's without a waggish response. I'll fill in a little, but not a whole lot, because I think some stuff would be giving away.
Sure.
There are a lot of things about this novel which I think are which is why I call it slipstream. And I think what I would call the slipstream reveal will go on with time. More than that, I cannot say. But one of the things that is frequently, I think, when people think of higher epic fantasy, the thought usually is of first of all, there's a real tendency to either go towards the Northwest European sort of model or to pointedly veer away from it. Sure. There's a tendency towards the feudal, or there's a tendency towards the imperial. There's a tendency toward things there was a greater past that we are struggling to recapture, or we are building towards something, or we are about, there is an established order that is about to get wiped out, and our hero must do something about it. I never thought about it until you asked me just now. Just as a matter of fact, it just came to me this very second. In the same way that I cite the Kane Riordan series in a kind of unusual place, it's not certainly not near future, nor is it far future. This incorporates elements of all those fantasy polarities I sort of just touched on. Yes, there is a lost past. Yes, there was a more powerful empire, but the process of empire and the sort of motivations that are afoot in the world are those motivations that would be consistent with empire, and the methodologies of empire are not gone, as we see from his upbringing in his apparent homeland of Dunara. So you've got a mixture of many different cultures. There's, if people are going to want to say, oh, this is Northwest European, all I'm going to say is, again, stay tuned. And actually, I think if anybody gives this novel a fair look, they're going to see that there are a lot of involvements of very different cultures that we may not have seen all of them, that the novel may have not cited itself in one of them yet, is just, you can only do so much, particularly when you're in book 1 and setting things up. But I think it's got all those flavors. That's one of the reasons I call it slipstream, but there's an orderliness about it, I think, in terms of what is Druadaen doing? I mean, right? He's trying to find out why the world is broken, as far as he can tell. That's and that leads him down some very scientific paths.
Yeah.
So that's another way in which it's slipstream. And again, I'll conclude by saying, stay tuned.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. He's we've already made a hash out of my questions. We're running laterally across them. That's okay. I don't want to use the word deconstruction. I don't think that you're deconstructing anything, but you interrogate a lot of things, and your choice of protagonist or your setup as protagonist really moves us in that direction, right? He sees things from an unusual perspective. He notices how things are put together. We see that from the very opening scenes when he sees it's like waterworks machinery or something, and he's 9 years old, right? And he recognizes, oh, this is what it's doing. And then as he's an adult, we see him asking questions about the Urgen, right? That's who we're talking about.
The Urge.
Yeah. The Urge. Okay, and is Urgen one then? Urgen is singular.
Urgen is plural.
Oh, okay. So he.
Well, it's also an adjective. It's also an adjective.
Okay, so he has he has a similar reaction when he sees them, right? Like, here's a set of known facts about the Urgen, and some of it doesn't quite add up. And this is the beginning of the story is structured around a series of conundrums. And the first conundrum is the Urgen, and we go into other ones. And this is something that lets you sort of interrogate. It seems to me heroic fantasy a little bit, and it also seems to me, I'm building up to I have a question here, I promise.
It's fine. I don't need. I'm enjoying this.
Okay, good. It seems to me also interrogating sort of gaming conventions. Like it seems to me like a person whose primary exposure to epic fantasy or heroic fantasy, if it was D&D, and you came here, you'd go, the language is different, but I recognize a lot of, ultimately maybe Tolkien inspired. The Urgen are something like orcs. We've got the species that's something like elves, clearly, except that at every turn you want to kind of stop and interrogate it. So I guess my question is, to what extent are you consciously incorporating kind of those gaming tropes or ideas to be able to interrogate them?
Bloody-minded intentionality.
Yeah.
Right down the middle. As a matter of fact, when the novel was proposed, one of the things that I said was it's going to actually take a number of beloved tropes and stand them on their head, which then feeds into which I try to blend with the idea of the fact that the world is broken, because part of, I guess, what you could say is there is I do this in various other ways. For instance, there's a point in the I'm definitely, I imagine this was pretty obvious. There's a part where he's talking about what is it with heroes and being orphans? What the hell is this? And he's noticing it as a statistical thing. He actually sees it. He goes and it's like, why are these people reported more often than not? You wouldn't think that's possible.
Yeah.
Now, I don't care whether that's actually real in the universe or not, but it's actually my way of sort of trying to tip my hat a little bit and say, there are conventions that really do want to be interrogated. I mean, there are very tired tropes. Yeah. And if you're going to do that, it should be more, I think, than what I would call a plot convenience. One of the things, of course, that's convenient about an orphan is that it's sort of in one sense, it gives them a great driver. Even the most serious novels, what will the driver be? Well, to replace all the relationships, the foundational relationships that character did not have, or that were taken from them, as the case may be. But I think the real question is, is who are orphans going to turn out to be? And the frequency with which that trope is used was something I could not let pass by without at least sort of giving it a jog in the ribs with my elbow, as I did, and full knowing, because Druadaen's orphaned at age 9, right? So
or at least practically, right?
Yes, that's a good point. Again, no spoilers.
Yeah.
But there is definitely. I think you're right. It's not deconstruction because it's not saying this is weak. It is saying if we're going to use these things, let's interrogate them. Let's make them make sense in their own right. It's going to become one of the things that folks will notice as they read this is that it right there in the very front, as you said, he's being raised by parents who themselves are very different. And how the parents are different is not entirely clear. But there's another scene in the family house when he returns, which indicates just how different the empire I guess you could say the remaining part of what was once called the Empire of the Silver Eagle, which is Dunara, is passing out knowledge and information, which is actually the rest of the world has tended to move away from that. It forgot it and didn't much care. And so there's an issue also of in the novel of what's the truth, and it's pretty much vertical in terms of organization in the novel. Every level of organization will come back down to that. Will come back down to questions of that, and to some degree the difficulty of knowing. So absolutely bloody minded that I was interrogating these things.
Yeah, well, good. Well, let me point out a couple fun examples. So there was a line that I loved, and I have forgotten who said it, but I think it's the guy who's the head of the adventuring band he falls in with. Ahern, that's it. And at an early point, they find some loot, and he kicks through it, and he says something like, oh, yeah, here it is. Ahern smirked at both the palmfuls of coin fragments, glanced at the room behind them. I remember when all those weapons, all that gear was pure treasure. Now we just turn our noses up at it. And I thought, wow, that's like 1,000 role-playing sessions I've been in where the party level 1, are desperate. Like, oh, I found a leather jerkin. Oh, yeah. And, once they've kind of looted enough opponents, then they start turning their nose up at that stuff. And
that's actually not where that one came from, though. I would have to say, I mean, it suits in a way, but I believe that happens in what is called the undergloom of Gurgrahar. And that is Ahern and his friend Elhwer are they were captive and they escaped in there. So when they're thinking about that, they're thinking about, imagine yourself being let loose in tunnels, which is where the various species of what are called the bent sort of shelter, because there's a bounty on them. They are not welcome on the surface, and so in this case, these two were, instead of being put to other purposes, were kept captive, and they escaped. They had nothing. They had absolutely nothing. So they're thinking of it more from the standpoint of survival in an environment where they knew very little of the language. They didn't know how they'd gotten in. They didn't know any way out. And for them, it's I would say it's more like, if anybody here has parents or grandparents, well, now it'd be grandparents almost certainly, who grew up in the Depression, or who grew up in privation in other parts of the world, not so fortunate as this one. Those people, the way that sort of leaves a mark, a very, very hard imprint on the way they see the world, the way they see possessions, their tendency towards salvaging and using everything they can. And at that moment, that's really much more about that, because this, unlike the Ahern does and the others do hope to make money. That's what they're in this for. Their thought is is that they are looking for goods. They don't want to be mercenaries. They don't want to be beholden to anybody else. It is not to make it very clear, it is not a world that is congenial to what in gaming would be considered adventuring parties. The world is very political. People with fighting skills are going to usually find it far more profitable and far more reliable to take one form of service or another. And magic, or what here's called, and there's a reason the term magic isn't used except by folks who've forgotten. Mansory is fairly rare, as shows up in the novel. This is not some sort of, florid and frequent magic use is absolutely not a part of this novel.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let me run, interesting. Okay, so let me run a different moment in the novel by you.
Yeah.
This is one where I thought, oh, this is an echo of a classic Tolkien moment, but it really interestingly goes a different way, which is in the Two Towers, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas chase a party of orcs with kidnapped hobbits across the plain. And when they get to the end of the pursuit, the orcs are dead, and they have this encounter with this mounted heroic culture, the Rohirrim.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interestingly similar sequence in which Druadaen, and now it turns out he's being pursued, first of all, although he's looking for a missing colleague, right, is what has him out on this plane. But he's being pursued by the Urgen, or some Bent, and it ends sort of similarly with this mounted heroic culture. Now I think the country is Turodden, and the adjective is Turond, though, right? Is that right?
Right. Okay. I would actually, that's something I actually was asked this question recently, and I would have been able to tell you better before I was asked.
You were asked the question because I asked it of the proofreaders, and they said,
right.
Yeah.
So Turodden is actually taken from the ruling family name.
Oh, okay.
But the language and an adjective would be Turond.
Turond. Okay.
Yeah. And it comes from Turo, Teuro. So the ending to the word means different things.
Yeah.
Signifies different things. And so your question about, are these the riders of Rohirrim? No, they're not. Well, it happens. Yeah, go ahead.
so I think I'm not saying you're copying them, but it's interesting because the conversation they have with Druadaen is interesting because they don't understand his culture, the consentium. They have sort of barbaric ideas or interpreting his culture, right? The absence of rank they interpret as everyone being noble, right? And they say everybody is filthy rich. They all have noble titles. And I thought this is really interesting. This is sort of, Tolkien could have gone here. He's got the Shire has elected mayors and stuff, right? But he just puts those cultures side by side, and then they go to Mount Doom. You put those cultures side by side and show that there is confusion, there's misunderstanding between them. And I just wondered if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, it was, if there are any, those similarities are entirely unintended. It was not intended as a Tolkien callback. It was the underlying issues, or I guess drivers of the fact that if you were to visit the main of Turodden, you would find that most of their forces are not riders. They have they have a number of fortified cities. They are actually, despite the fact that they seem perhaps barbaric in comparison to Druadaen and Dunarans, they would be considered probably a very high culture in terms of literacy, technological capabilities, things like this. But it is a mark of just how many different levels, therefore, there are in the world. The fact that you're running into riders is because you wouldn't want to send any force out on these plains that isn't mounted. Sure. Because the Bent have huge advantages in endurance more than anything else, and they will run you to the ground, which is exactly what's happening with Druadaen, who, as you said, has been seeking a lost outrider of one of his. He's an outrider, and there's an outrider that was up here and has apparently gone missing. So that brings him here. So to some degree, it was the fact that they were riders is actually an outgrowth of the environment in which it was taking place. They have just as many folks who would be foresters if you go to their forests and things like that. But it's actually kind of nice. I didn't see it. I suppose at some level I was, they say you only steal from the best, so maybe I was. But the opportunity for a cultural contrast was very, very was very, very intentional, because the follow on to that, where the one says, "You're all nobles, aren't you?" And he says, "No, none of us are nobles." He says, "Well, you're all rich." He says, "Well, he says, look, how many of you starve?" And Druadaen thinks to himself, he's got a point. Yeah. The starvation is pretty much unknown in Dunara. And that was a way for me to also sort of underscore, even in a well-organized nation outside of Dunara in this sort of post-imperial period, there's a world of want. And that's one of the things that I also try to introduce early on when Druadaen is looking out in right in the first chapter. He's looking out over a port, all the ships that have come into Dunara, and he looks at how interesting they are. They speak all these different languages. They're dressed in all these different ways, and then when he begins to realize that everything in Dunara is sort of almost, for instance, Eli Whitney, the lesson of Eli Whitney regarding mass production would not be at all a novelty in Dunara. That's a lot of the ways they do things, which is a holdover from the sort of the imperial methodicism, being methodical that way. And he realizes all of a sudden, my gosh, the people that I thought were grandparents down there, the parents, they're thin, not because they probably don't get enough to eat, not because they're fit and they do all these things with ships and are moving boxes around. No. And there's a very different world beyond the boundaries of Dunara, which is one of the reasons why this probably truly, that's a way in which I would say the Bildungsroman vibe is very much, I would say, sort of backed up, emphasized, amplified by the fact that this is not just going out into the world. This is going out into the world and waking up. Yeah. That the whole world is not as safe and as filled with comparative plenty as the one in which you grew up and which you assumed to be just the norm, which is a little bit, I think, there you're talking about an intention that has nothing to do with fantasy and perhaps a little bit more to do with the way people in the developed world on this planet find it very easy to forget or never really even have to encounter the fact that the rest of the world is living under very different circumstances.
And think about why, maybe.
Yeah, and think about why. Exactly right.
Fantastic. Well, okay. Well, so let's go back. So now we can start the interview. Those are like the kind
those are the appetizers.
Yeah, that was. So okay, so your protagonist, our point of view character is Druadaen. We meet him in a journal entry when he's 9, and I think his father or mother said, "Hey, you should keep a journal," and so he says, "I should keep a journal," and he's like,
and he can't spell journal.
Yeah, one scratches it out. So tell us about him. What makes him interesting? Why'd you pick him for the protagonist?
Because, and I suppose this may be another trait of me as an author. I avoid archetypes that you can pigeonhole. I think I know I can open a story and I say, I think I know where we're going here. Just in terms of, is this in fantasies, you're usually dealing with one of a handful of archetypes, which now, of course, we think about in terms of gaming. But that's because that's sort of like that's a little bit of thinking that history is the cart
Yes.
and then the horse in front of it,
Yes.
because we get that from myth, we get that from Tolkien, we get that from Dunsany, we get that from Le Morte d'Arthur, we get and we get it from sword and sorcery novels of Fritz Lieber and Howard, and long before anybody sat down and said, can we tell our own stories and use dice to determine outcomes? These were fixed things. I think the shame certainly I've made part of my living early on in my career through writing for games. I certainly discovered games at a very early age, at 13, I believe. So I was right there at sort of, the opening of it. But what they've done is they've made what were tropes, what were archetypes, now have become so heavily used that they've become almost self-parodies. You can, and so one of the things that I did when I sat down and wrote this was I said, whatever character I'm using, whatever they do, I'm going to contradict what you expect at some point in your exposure of them. You may at first think that Ahern is a big, dumb, bluff, emotionally unintelligent fighter type. Oh, no, particularly as we get to the second half of the novel, we realize why he's doing it, and the fact that he actually read a lot, and he uses that sort of demeanor as a way to be underestimated. And so there's and I will again subvert. I think there are moments when I do not deconstruct, but I will interrogate, and in the course of interrogation, if I find something wanting, I will subvert it. And I think each one of the characters are at some level an attempt to subvert the easy tropes of fantasy characters. So, and I can't even say if that really addresses your question. I guess it does more broadly.
So, because some of the other characters, you look at them and you say, okay, human fighter, elf, rogue, which maybe in itself is a little subversion. You got an elf character who's really interested in poisons.
And is actually probably the least concerned with killing people.
Yeah, exactly. Surprisingly noble orc characters, right? Not unambiguously, but I don't want to give any spoilers, but I was charmed by the moment when they realized what they had really gone down into the Undergloom for. Right? It's like, oh, yeah, okay. So maybe, right, where you're going with this is that Druadaen is not an obviously classable character. It's not clear that he's what he wants to be is a legionnaire, right? He wants to be
yes.
And I think at least the first 2/3 of the book, maybe right up to the end, he will doggedly say, and then I will get into the Legion, and then I will get into the Legion. But he's in this kind of meritocratic society where, at least for some of the big institutions, you kind of test in and you get admitted or you don't. So he's an orphan, right? And I will say, let me phrase this as a question, an observation and a question. So I think one of his, and I've already said this, his things that makes him distinctive is his ability to see things from an unusual perspective and then kind of ask questions. Now, to what extent does this make him sort of Cain Riordan-like, right? I mean, is his real ability, is this like a Gannon-esque type where he's like, he's sort of learning man, capital L, capital M, right? Is sort of the mode of the hero.
So I think a yes or a no would do disservice to the question, and also would not fill a lot of airtime. So we'll
good.
Which Dave might be thinking that would be a blessing. But I would say that asking questions, why is why and how are always questions. I think I find to some extent that's probably me coming through, because I'm pretty much that person who accepts very little on face value. And I would say I find the most interesting characters to write. They embody some part of that. I find also that if you're not asking questions about the broader world, one of the reasons why I guess I'm a fan of the Odyssey, for all of its flaws, for all of the fact that it's a collection of Homeric hymns, not a sort of unified work, for all the fact that if we insist on taking our present moment and using that as the ruler against which we would measure older works, then yes, it is a very sexist work, and it would have many warts if written today. But what I like about it is that Odysseus is, first of all, in one of the primary translations, the first line in that translation is, "This is the story of a man who was never at a lack." And it is the resourceful hero. If you're just big brain, if you're just big muscle, that strikes me as a kind of one-trick pony. How far can you go with it? And the habit to be realistic, not a lot of people, in my experience, numerically, there are a lot of people who change their gears in their 20s, who did not ask a lot of questions before, who do. I think actually that's one of the enduring values of a college education delivered, going back to the idea of what would a good professor academic do. That would be one of the things, not to pass out wisdom or receive knowledge or things like that, but to ask the questions that make a person want to live a life of asking questions and engage the world and come up with new answers, because you only come up with new answers when you question what's already there. So for me, all of the mileage, how much legs does a character have? How much legs does a story have, is to some extent connected directly to how many questions can you ask? Is it just overcoming obstacles? If it's just overcoming obstacles, I mean, I can enjoy that story, but I will be pleasantly surprised if it gives me anything more than enjoyment. Yeah. It's a big world. There's a lot to our own, any others we might imagine, and it's finding your way through it in a thoughtful manner that I think makes for me the character that I'm interested in writing. So I don't know that means that they're all alike, but they do tend to have a trait in common. It strikes me, you see a lot of characters, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll give you an example. I think that, first of all, let's go to one that we all know pretty much, whether love, revile, or see in context is a different issue, is the Conan series, right? Sword and Sorcery, clearly a delivery for entertainment. And yet the closest and Howard is very, very deft in this. Every once in a while, Conan has an epiphanic moment and makes an observation. But in general, that's not his personality type. If you ever wanted the Sword and Sorcery to be more than overcoming the obstacles, and actually kind of an interesting look at what constituted evil, it does a much better job. It does a much better job of sort of digging around at what are the different kinds of evil, what are the different ways it manifests in the world. But it doesn't really answer the question of what would good be, and also how do you achieve balance? Because you're never gonna make, the utopian dream is well labeled. It's a dream. It's an objective, and as long as it's an objective, I think it's potentially an ennobling one. But if we actually measure our success or failure by achieving it, you're going to be a lot of depressed people around. Yeah. And I think sometimes it leaves a lot of people depressed because there's a disconnect with there's a reason we call it an ideal, not an achievable reality. So for me, these characters are ways to talk about these questions in character and to talk about not just, let's say, evil, which I think is kind of, that's low-hanging fruit as far as I'm concerned. I think the harder one is what you see, you're talking about those conversations between, Druadaen and his Turan rescuers, right? Is how do different people get by? What are their different societies made up of? And in contrast, what do they maybe make us reflect upon regarding our own choices and ethical lives? So I find it fun to ask questions about things.
Yeah.
But I also feel that is the pathway to actually giving a theme to a novel which doesn't bang you over the head in some sort of didactic attempt to essentially advance a given ideology. I'm not interested in any ideology in my books. Anybody who comes to my books looking for either one, you're not going to be pleased, because I think the world, usually ideology, in my opinion, whichever it is a simplified way of boiling down a much more complicated situation. And I'm sorry, I think that one of the things that makes a world believable is it's got to be just as complicated as we know life to be.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's absolutely right. So I noticed here that we've sort of come back around and touched on that specialization obliquely, the sort of specialization of scholars, and one of the things you've, I think, implied, or I'll tease it out of what you said, is, hey, it's not just scholars, and when we talk about, at least we're talking about characters in books, people get specialized as the fighter, as the assassin, as the whatever, and I'm really interested in your point that lack of specialization gives you sort of exposure to the questions and the ability to kind of ask. Actually, I'm going to here's a connection that maybe was not in your mind, but Adam Smith, okay, you didn't see this coming, The Wealth of Nations. He talks about, there's a passage where he talks about making pins, and he says, listen, we get the cheapest pins if we specialize the tasks. If there's somebody in a pin factory whose job is to draw the wire, and there's a separate person who snips the wire, and there's someone else who all they do all day is they turn the head of the needle, and someone sharpens
Aristotle's Politics.
Yeah, so we get the most pins
all the way back. Yep.
But we don't get the most interesting people that way. He says the person who's more interesting, and the one he uses, he says the plowman. The plowman has to keep his plow in working order. He has to know how to repair it. He has to understand the temperament of the animal. He has to understand the effect of temperature on the consistency of soil he's going to plow, and 1,000 other things to be a good plowman. It's not as efficient as the pin maker who just sharpens pins, but it makes for a way more interesting human soul.
I also think I would absolutely go with that. And I think that it's interesting, because I think if Aristotle could see what that initial, encouragement to specialization, because basically saying that a city cannot grow without specialization, and therefore city-state ? But I also see, to me, there's that pin maker, and I'm thinking of sweatshops all over the world. There's both the moral issue of the economy of it, because it actually gives, when you think about it, it would give people an incentive to make sure that that's all that people know how to do. But then if all they're knowing how to do is to make this one thing, it would be an unusual change in human nature for people to be happy with that, which means if that's going to be the most efficient way to do it, and the most efficient way to do it is, for lack of a better term, soul crushing, because you only do this one thing and that's all you're going to be paid for, and that's the only thing you're valued for. Unless the majority, the great majority, are happy to bend their neck to that brutal yoke, you're going to have what Marx tells you about, which is sort of like, there's going to be, you are breeding an economic situation that will create unhappiness. Now, he talks about it on terms that I'm not so very interested in. It's not that I don't think that Marx doesn't bring us interesting models. I just think that that's what they are. They're interesting models. Most economic observations are interesting models. I've never found one that really, in my mind, encapsulates and captures all the moving bits, and the parts that defy quantification, which are the human spirit. I don't want to make pins. I don't want to be just a pin maker. And the terrifying outcome to this is, you talk about science fiction, Brave New World. That's why, to me, Brave New World is the far more dangerous book in terms of what it would, if it's an accurate prediction, than 1984. 1984 has the seeds of its own destruction built into it. Live by the sword, they will die by the sword. That will happen. But the seduction and then the genetic breeding of people, if they're people anymore, who are happy to make the pins. Right. They're adapted to make the pins. That is terrifying, because that I could see be something that happens. Yeah. Make people pliable. And so this and I Adam Smith. See, you got me to Adam. You brought in Adam Smith. We've gone way the hell off the beaten track. But I think you brought in Marx. The point is well taken about educator Albert North Whitehead. He had a model of learning, romance, precision, generalization. I don't know if you're familiar with it, and probably a lot of our listeners aren't, but basically these three stages are: romance is like when you're 3, and it's sort of like you like painting, so put your fingers in paint, make pictures, and use Play-Doh and use the paint on the plate. Just go wild, have fun. Once you are doing that, or whatever the topic may be, growing plants, etc., then comes the precision, which is, okay, now do you want certain outcomes? If you want certain outcomes, here are the things which we have discovered tend to produce those outcomes. Now, that would tend to make only pin makers, right? But then the last phase is generalization, which is, now that you have both found this thing you love, or find the things you love in whatever the topic is, and then you have applied precision to it, now you're at the level where generalize it. You think about it in terms of another discipline. Think about it in terms of what isn't being done. Think about it in terms of the changes that have occurred between the time that all those standards were set and where we are now. And if there's a new evolutionary stage to take. And that's coming back to the need, I guess, for a generalist view of things is very interesting to me. And yeah, I would say that's absolutely, all these characters tend to show what I think, people who will decide to go out and take matters into their own hands and then manage to live for more than a year doing it are probably going to have some of the inventiveness and some of the multi-talented components of a generalist, which is why I think that if you look at the protagonists in this, that's a fairly common trait amongst most of them.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's follow Druadaen's career a little bit. We want to be careful.
One last thing that I'd like to say. You were talking about precision and we got on ideologies and things like that. All I can say to readers out there is a dragon in this book, no surprise based on the cover. But does the dragon have something to say about that? If you think about his take on which books actually managed to survive across the gulfs of time. Oh. Because he has a comment on that, which I would like to think may have relevance to our modern age as well.
Tune in next week for the second and final part of Butler's discussion with Charles Gannon about This Broken World. And now, John Ringo's Live Free or Die.
Mr. Rail is in a meeting, the executive secretary said sternly. And if I'm wrong, he'll fire me, Jeff said, breezing past her. I said stop. Jeff opened the door to the president of Northeastern Operations offices and strode across the carpet to his desk. Mr. Rail was, in fact, reading the Wall Street Journal. He looked up as the door opened, tilted his head to the side, and set the paper down. "This is either important or you've just pretty much killed your career," Rail said, mildly. Jeff walked up to the desk and held his finger to his lips. Then he held out his hands, cupped, so the executive could see the attacert for just a moment. "It's about the CFID project, sir," Jeff said. "The one we used to call Babylon. Tyler Vernon used to work with me over at Verizon, and I thought he might have some ideas. As it turns out, he does." "It's okay, Bernice," Rail said, waving at his secretary. "This really is an emergency. I'll be in Shield Room 5. "Mr. Tyler," Weasley Rail said heartily as soon as the door was closed. "Pleasure to see you in the building again." "Pleasure to see you too, Mr. Weasley," Tyler said as Jeff winced. Damn it. It's Tyler Vernon, isn't it? Sorry." "We both got the same problem with our names, sir," Tyler said, smiling. "No offense intended." "None taken," Rail said. "What have you got?" "I have to meet tomorrow night clandestinely with the Glaton," Tyler said, sitting down. "I need to pick up a pickup's load of a certain product. Less than a pickup's load, actually. They will trade me a full pickup of Atasurk." "Christ," Jeff said. 6 petabytes of variable use memory, infinite parallel processor, and the size of a match head. You could buy... Name a third world country. Name a country. I don't think anyone's seen a case of it in one place." "More than that," Tyler said. "As you said, nobody has seen a case in one place. You can replace a server farm with one chip. The value I saw someone calculate in Wired on a standard dry bushel of it is $100 billion, which nobody can afford. A pickup load is going to distort that price. I still need $1 million, at least $100,000 in cash. That's for those. AT&T gets some serious players that can pay for the rest. I'll take a check. We'll negotiate for it here. AT&T gets 1% as the house, and I need to do this quick because time's a wasting. Among other things, I'll need to get the money from a bank, and they close soon. Banks stay open to surprising hours when the right people call," Rail said. "It's not worth $1 million. Among other things, some of it's bad," Tyler said. "I also got the information that it's their scrap and about 100 years old." "More or less what we thought," Rail said, narrowing his eyes. "But that sounds like you got more information out of the Glaton than most governments." "They are, surprisingly, fans of my series," Tyler said, shrugging. "I just remembered I owe them a sketch. That's beside the point. $1 million. $200,000, Rail said. "The 100 in cash is no problem. I'll call JP. "Not going to just give this away," Tyler said. $900 and that's flat. Novell is just down the road, and I know people there too. $250, and I'll make sure you can breeze in and out of the bank. And 20% on the trades. Wednesday morning work?" "Wednesday morning works, but if you think I'm giving you 20%, you've been drinking. 2%, $875. 18 and 3. I'll tell you the truth. I'm not going lower than 9, and I'm not going higher than 4. Take it or leave it." "I'll leave it, but I'll get closer. 12% and $500,000. Seriously, that's a good deal." "Totally sucks. 5 and 800. Rail considered his opponent and shrugged. "I'd be doing a disservice to the shareholders if I went lower than 10% as house. There's going to be costs involved, and 800 is highway robbery. 600. 750. 7. Done. I'll geek to 10. "Then we have a deal," Rail said, standing up. "I'll need to go get the check cut personally. 8 a.m. Wednesday morning?" Can you get the right people here by then? Tyler asked. We're taking cases of Atacirc, and it has to be all sub rosa. We've gotten used to working around the Horvath, Rail said with a sigh. They fortunately either don't pay as much attention as people think or can't count. We've simply had to sneak materials through the system beyond what they allow. We are, in other words, used to this sort of thing. I can get the right people here, with their checkbooks. Speaking of which, stay here. I'll go get the check. Tyler tried not to bounce as he walked to his truck. He still had a lot of stuff to get done, and if the Horvath were watching, it could still get very sticky. Mr. Vernon, this is a surprise? Yeah, Tyler said, trying to remember the red-headed guy's name. No chance. Good to, see you again. Dan, the man said, holding out his hand as if to shake. In it was a badge. Hey, can we talk? Sure, Dan, Tyler said, trying not to curse. I'm sort of busy at the moment. Email me? My van's right over here, Dan said, putting his hand on Tyler's arm. Come on. Won't take a second. Tyler, feeling both pissed and a tad nervous, got in the black-tinted van. It had been rigged as something of a mobile command post, but what was interesting was that there were no electronics. There were some cameras that looked as if they were 15 years old, but super advanced at the time. Chemical photography cameras. And lots of paper. Mr. Vernon, a man in a suit said, 50s and a bit chubby with an incongruous goatee. My name is Senior Special Agent Aaron Spuler. Welcome to the command post of Project 4038. Which is spying on Tyler Vernon? Tyler asked. There are laws, you know. Which is spying on aliens who can, what was the phrase? Go through our most advanced firewalls so easily it's like looking through an open window, Spuler said. And anyone who has interaction with them. Because every interaction with ETs is a potential national security problem as long as that goddamned Horvath ship is in the sky. Which is pretty indiscreet of you to say, Tyler said. Give us some credit, please, Agent Poor said. This is a shield car, and we made sure you were not carrying your cell. Maple syrup? Spuler asked incredulously. They're addicted to maple syrup? Shh, Tyler said. Christ, now everybody's going to know. Our job is gathering information, Mr. Vernon, SSA Spuler said, not giving it out. And don't worry about congressional investigations or something. Nobody wants to know we exist. Their chemistry is incompatible with ours, Agent Poor said. How can they metabolize it? No clue, Tyler said. But they reacted like it was booze or something. We saw the reaction, Spuler said, waving at the cameras. But the problem is the Horvath. The Glaton apparently have as much control over the Horvath information systems as Horvath have over ours, Tyler said. Or so they say. We're going to meet tomorrow night. I need to go get some money and then somehow get my hands on a truckload of maple syrup without the Horvath finding out. They'll come to me and give me cover for the transfer. Frankly, it feels a bit like a drug deal. Your truck? Spuler asked. Yes. That should escape their notice as long as they are not actively watching you, Spuler said. More would be harder. The flip side is that if this is popular among the Glaton, it could give us some leverage. I've thought about that, Tyler said, holding up a hand to forestall a reply. Let me just be clear about something. I'm not going to play puppet to the government. By the same token, yes, I care about that damned Horvath ship and this country and the world and humanity. and I will do my level best to figure out a way to get it out of our sky. But right now, I need to go get some money and find 6 55-gallon drums of maple syrup in about 30 hours. We're not going to get involved in a purely commercial enterprise, Spuler said. But this isn't on one level. If you need our help, we'll be around. Thanks, Tyler said. Can I get out now? Feel free, Spuler said, waving at the door. Just try not to get the world destroyed, okay? Doing my best, Tyler said, yanking open the door. When he got to his truck, Tyler picked up his cell phone and brought up his contacts. Hey, Petra, Tyler said, trying not to sigh. Tyler, Petra said. It was that tone, that I'm unsatisfied with the situation, but I'm not going to bring it up tone. Sorry I've been behind on my payments. I'm going to slide some money over this week. Thank you, Petra said civilly. I'm doing some projects with AT&T, so the money should be better, Tyler said. So, hopefully, no more money issues. That would be nice. It's hard enough to make it on the settlement as it is. The girls are right here. Tyler thought about his kids every day. What he had not thought about until that moment was what that meant in terms of his current doings. It took him less than a second, a very brief pause, to make the hardest decision of his life. He hadn't talked to his kids in 2 weeks, and he realized he might not be talking to them for months. But when you sail in harm's way, you don't take hostages. He squelched the screaming inside. Don't really have the time, he said airily. Gotta go. Bye. Petra Vernon closed her cell phone and looked at it with a puzzled expression. She and Tyler might have had their differences, and schedules might have prevented him seeing the girls much, but he always wanted to talk to them. They'd been married for 10 years, and even over the phone she could read him like a book. Something was going on, and it was very odd. And if he didn't want to talk to the girls, there was a reason. She made a face and put the phone in her pocket. She'd find out what was going on when it started to smell. Hey, Mr. Hazelbauer! Tyler yelled, waving at the tractor. Jason Hazelbauer was one of the old farmers in the district. A lot of people had moved in from outside the area of late. Most of those were Vermonters and people from the People's Republic of Massachusetts, looking for somewhere cheaper to live, and immediately wanting to change things so they were as screwed up as Vermont and Massachusetts. The Hazelbauers, though, were descended from Hessians who decided they'd rather farm alongside the Scots and English of the White Mountains than fight them. Mr. Vernon, the farmer said in a slow New England drawl. Pleasure to see ya. Fine weather we're having. Great, Tyler said. Leaves are coming out a treat. Be a good winter for the sap, Hazelbauer said, climbing off the tractor. Good leaves means good sap. And how are you doing? Well, sir, well, Tyler said. For all he dressed like a homeless guy, Hazelbauer probably owned more land than Mrs. Cranshaw, and, notably, a maple syrup distillery, and about as renowned for keeping his own counsel as Mrs. Cranshaw was for being a revolting bitch. He was also, Tyler recalled as he craned his head up and then up again, the single most massive guy Tyler had ever met. He looked more like a mountain than a human being. I have a rather unusual request. Are you carrying a cell phone? Don't hold with them. Mr. Hazelbauer said. If someone wants me, they can call me at home, and if I don't answer, they can come to find me if it's that important. Yes, sir, Tyler said. He'd heard that about Hazelbauer as well. Just rather not have anyone listening in on our conversation. Some people can listen to them even if they're turned off. Yep, Hazelbauer said, narrowing his eyes and adjusting his ball cap. What have you gotten yourself into, young man? Simple trade, sir, simple trade, Tyler said. The thing is, I need to buy some barrels of maple syrup, but I need it to look as if I'm not buying them. I don't need anyone knowing my business. That's an odd request, young man, Mr. Hazelbauer said, tilting his head to the side. Well, sir, Tyler said, shrugging. It's got a bit to do with the revenuers. Ah, Hazelbauer said, his face going hard. Them. You need not say more. When do you need it? I'd like to do it like this. There's a spaceship landing in Homer's field, Tyler whispered to himself in wonder as the stars were occluded. The sky was clear and bright with a thin crescent moon, what the locals still called a smuggler's moon. New Hampshire had, back in the day, been a major supplier of corn whiskey to the lowland folks, back when people considered a tax of 15% on their hard work of running a still to be a slap in the face. There was more than one meaning to the state's motto. A shiner's moon was gibbous, half full to full. That was when you could see well enough by night to get the still running and the mules with corn up to the hollers. Up in the hollows of the hills, the smell of the distilling was caught and held, keeping the revenue agents from finding you, making shine. To bring it down to city folk with their silver, you needed good dark to sneak past those revenuers. A smuggler's moon. Do you have the stuff? Wathet whispered as he stepped off the cargo ramp. 6 barrels of first-quality dragon's tears, Tyler whispered back. There was no point to whispering. Nobody was moving this time of night, and Homer's field was back off the road. But the whole thing did have the feel of a drug deal. That was fine by Tyler. Grandad had had a few stories about slipping past revenuers here and there. Family tradition was being upheld. Awesome, Fabbit said, dragging something that looked like a cross between a broom and a forklift. Tyler opened up the back of the truck and started to roll one of the barrels off onto the ground. Got it, Fabbit said, sliding the device into place. He carried the 600-pound barrel away through the air. Anti-grav, Tyler said with a sigh. Might be able to do something about that if this stuff takes off, Wathet said. By the way, when my head finally cleared, I felt screwed. Come on, Tyler protested. You're trading trash for something you're going to make a fortune on. And on that subject, we need to talk. What? Wathet said. You want my firstborn? No, Tyler said. I want your corporations. You want me to give this up? Wathet said. No way. Come back in about 30 of our days, Tyler said. I'll have 2 of our heavy trucks loaded with dragon's tears. That's about enough to fill your cargo hold. But between now and then, you need to contact your corporations. I'm going to get as much of a control in this market as I can. I am, hereby, willing to contract that the ship Spinward Crossing, crew thereof, will get 5% of any trade in dragon's tears in which I engage with other parties. If they will, upon determining that there is an economic worth to dragon's tears, engage with major Glatoon corporate partners for further trade. Bottom line, you get 5% of all the dragon's tears I trade for the rest of your life. Well, split however you split stuff. If I'm trading with multiple corporations, I can get more than you're going to get me, right? Trade for what? Wathay said thoughtfully. I mean, you guys are trading for Atasurk. Wow, I get 5% of all the Atasurk you guys buy? No way. Think I'm just going to trade for Atasurk? Tyler said. I'm not sure how to do it, but I'm going to trade for whatever you guys use as currency, and not cheap, and then buy Atasurk. New stuff that's not crap. You guys don't have a hypernode point on the whole damn planet, Wathay said. Then the first thing I'll trade for is a hypernode link, Tyler said. Wathay, we've got a Horvath ship sitting on our necks. We need your big guys to sit up and take notice. That's not going to happen, sorry, because a small-time free trader got lucky. It will if they're making the profits. Think about it. Especially since sooner or later the Horvath will find out about this, and then they'll cut us both out. In my case, probably cut up. They'll take the dragon's tears, trade it to your big corporations, and you'll be back to trading with primitive planets for coconut shells and folk art. All transferred, Fabit said. Hey, can I? No, Wathay said. That last point has merit, I'll admit. I'll think about it. Oh, one more thing, Tyler said, going to his front seat and pulling out a jug. Look, I know we're not contracted on this, but that primitive folk art, could I, buy it back from you? Hell yeah, Wathay said, hefting the jug. For this? Sure. I don't get the night painting anyway. The painter was kind of cracked, Tyler said. It's the night sky the way he saw it. Tyler started at the tap on his window and sat up, rolling down the window. Were you here all night? Jeff asked, looking around the secure garage. I had Ireland's worth of Atasurk in the back, Tyler said, wiping his eyes and yawning. What was I going to do, sit at home with a shotgun on my lap? He set the shotgun on the floor. Not to mention what you had up front, Jeff said, his eyes wide. Is that... Yeah, Tyler said, getting out. And 2 Goyas and a Matisse and some Italian guy from the Renaissance. I couldn't fit the Venus. Wathay had said he'd store it for me off-planet. I'd appreciate it if AT&T would do me the same service on-planet. Lord knows I'm not going to keep 'em in my house. Maybe Starry Starry Night. It'd look great in the kitchen. Well, come on up to the conference room, Jeff said. We'll get some coffee in you. A donut would be nice. Gentlemen, welcome, Rail said, nodding at the executives gathered in the shield room. Sorry for the crowding, but I think this is the appropriate venue. By arrangement with Mr. Tyler Vernon, we have a rather large quantity of Atasurk available. AT&T will be taking a 10% cut on all trades. We will be bidding by a lot, which will be, a case-by-case basis. How many? An Asian asked. 26 cases, Tyler said. All the Spinward Crossing could fit in my pickup. It was up to the roof. They're hauling them up here at the moment. There was a problem of spoofing the internal cameras so the Horvath wouldn't notice. 26? The man had a British accent. Bloody hell! I don't suppose you'd like to tell us what you're trading? I'll let the term proprietary hang in the air, Tyler said, sipping his coffee. The Atasurk we're getting is, of course, not consistent, Rail said. As soon as it is delivered, you will be given an opportunity to examine each case and decide what it is worth, and then we'll get the bidding started. I think they went a little crazy off that one case nobody could find any faults in, Tyler said, rifling through the checks. They were the big kind, so people could fit all the zeros. Feeling a bit stunned? Rail asked in a contented tone. He was going to come out of this smelling like a rare hybrid rose, He'd just made a fair bit of AT&T's profits for the quarter in one day's work. It's not every day that a guy becomes an instant billionaire, Tyler said. Multi-billionaire. In fact, I don't think anyone has ever become a multi-billionaire in a day. So, what are you going to do with it? Jeff asked. And is anyone else really in the mood for a drink? Champagne would be about right, Weasley said. Tyler's buying. I am in a mood for a drink, Tyler said. But first, I need to see a lawyer. Besides the tax implications, which are going to be large, I've got some stuff to buy. I'll need to take a rain check.
That was another installment in our ongoing audiobook serialization of John Ringo's Live Free or Die. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks as always to audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Thanks to G.J. Butler, and praise, thanks, and gratitude to Charles E. Gannon for sitting down and talking about his new novel with us. And good night, Tony Daniel, wherever you are. This is David Afsharirad coming to you from a soundproof booth somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Tune in here next week at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.